I remember the taste of my mother's bread, sweet honey and grain from the southern fields of Viridia Prime, baked in the early hours before the work bells rang across our settlement. The memory comes to me now as I stand in the armoring chambers of the fortress monastery, watching the crimson paint dry on my ceramite plates. 437 years have passed since I last tasted bread. 437 years since I was called anything other than Brother Cassius of the Blood Raven's Third Company. They tell the children of the Imperium that we are angels, living gods wrapped in blessed armor descended from the Emperor's own genetic legacy to protect humanity from the darkness beyond the stars. In their picture books and cathedral murals, we shine like silver saints, our bolters singing hymns of righteousness as we cut through heretic and alien alike. The propaganda feeds speak of our glory, our honor, our eternal vigilance. What they never speak of is the price. What they never tell you is that to become an angel, you must first learn to forget you were ever human. I was 11 when the chaplains came to our world. 11 years old, playing war games in the agricultural fields with my younger brother Matthias while our parents worked the harvest lines. The sky was the color of burnished copper that day, heavy with the promise of rain that would never come. The drought had lasted 6 months, and the planetary governor's tithes remained unchanged. People were beginning to whisper words that would have earned them a flogging in the capital, but in the outer settlements, desperation breeds loose tongues. The thunder started just after midday prayer. Not the rumble of weather, but something deeper, more mechanical. Matthias and I climbed the tallest grain tower in our sector to get a better look, our small hands gripping the rusted ladder rungs as we ascended toward the sound. What we saw changed everything. Drop pods. 12 of them, descending through the atmosphere like falling stars, their retro thrusters carving bright scars against the copper sky. They struck the earth in perfect formation, each impact crater precisely calculated to surround our settlement without damaging the harvest infrastructure. When the smoke cleared and the ramps lowered, they emerged, Space Marines of the Blood Ravens chapter. Even at 11, even as a simple agri-world child who had never seen anything more threatening than a pack of feral groks, I knew what they were. Every citizen of the Imperium knows. The Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's chosen, angels of death, but seeing them in person, watching them stride through our settlement with their massive frames casting long shadows over the dust, I felt something I had never expected. Terror. They were too large, too perfect, too far removed from anything human. Their armor sang with embedded hymns as they moved, each footstep creating small tremors in the ground beneath us. When they spoke, their voices carried the mechanical resonance of vox amplifiers, turning simple words into pronouncements from on high. They had come for recruitment, they announced. The chapter required new aspirants, and Viridia Prime had been selected for the honor of contributing to the Emperor's armies. My mother wept when they called my name, not tears of joy, as the settlement administrator assured everyone, but something deeper, something that spoke of loss and endings rather than glory and honor. She knew, somehow, what the rest of us were only beginning to understand. Her son would leave that day, but he would never return. The thing that came back, if anything came back at all, would wear his face but carry none of his heart. The selection process was swift and merciless. Physical examination, genetic screening, psychological evaluation. Of the 300 children in our settlement between the ages of 10 and 12, only 7 passed the initial requirements. I was among them. Matthias was not. I still remember the look in his eyes as the chaplain's servo skull completed his biological scan and moved on without recording his data. Relief and disappointment warred in his expression, and I found myself envying him even as I felt proud of my own selection. We were allowed no farewells, no final meals with our families, no last nights in familiar beds. The chaplains explained that attachment to our former lives would only weaken us in the trials ahead. We were no longer the children of Viridia Prime. We were aspirants of the Blood Ravens, servants of the Emperor, and our old identities had become irrelevant impediments to our transformation. The journey to the chapter's fortress monastery took 3 months aboard a massive battle barge called the Litany of Fury. 3 months in the ship's lower decks, crammed into dormitories with aspirants from dozens of other worlds. Boys who had been farmers like me, but also former gang fighters from hive cities, tribal warriors from death worlds, and noble-born youth from civilized planets. The chapter cast its net wide, seeking not just physical strength but genetic compatibility with the gene seed of their primarch. During the voyage, we learned our first lesson about what it meant to serve the Astartes. We learned about expendability. Of the 47 aspirants who had boarded the ship, only 32 survived the journey. Some died from failed medical procedures as the ship's apothecaries began the preliminary organ implantation process. Others succumbed to the constant combat training, their bones snapping under the weight of conditioning regimens designed to prepare human children for superhuman trials. A few simply broke mentally, their minds unable to process the magnitude of what they were becoming. Those ones were the fortunate ones. They died quickly. The fortress monastery of the Blood Ravens sits on a moon called Aurelia's Grief, orbiting a dead star in a system long forgotten by Imperial cartographers. It is a structure of impossible scale, carved from the moon's living rock and reinforced with adamantium bulkheads that could withstand orbital bombardment. Gothic spires reach toward the void like grasping fingers, each one housing training chambers, meditation cells, and the countless artifacts that the chapter has recovered from across the galaxy. Walking through its corridors for the first time, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. 10,000 years of warfare had passed through these halls. Thousands of aspirants had walked the same paths I walked, and most of them had died in the trying. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of failure and sacrifice, of boys who had dreamed of becoming angels and found only death waiting for them in the darkness. The true trials began immediately upon our arrival. They called it the Proving, though I would later learn that this was merely the first of many tests designed to break us down and rebuild us according to the chapter's needs. For 6 months, we were subjected to physical conditioning that would have killed fully grown men from our homeworlds. We ran obstacle courses in powered armor too heavy for our developing frames. We fought hand-to-hand combat exercises against servitors programmed to maim rather than simply defeat us. We studied the Codex Astartes until we could recite its tactical doctrines in our sleep, and then we were tested on our knowledge while enduring pain that would have driven adults to madness. Of the 32 aspirants who had arrived on Aurelia's Grief, only 18 survived the first month. The others were interred in unmarked graves in the monastery's lower chambers, their names recorded in the chapter's archives but never spoken aloud again. We were forbidden to mourn them. We were told that grief was a weakness that would compromise our effectiveness as warriors. Those who showed signs of emotional attachment to their fallen brothers were subjected to additional conditioning, a process that involved drugs, hypno-indoctrination, and in some cases, surgical modification of brain chemistry. I learned to stop caring about the names of the boys who disappeared during training. It was a survival mechanism, but it was also something more fundamental, a necessary amputation of human empathy that would serve me well in the centuries to come. The first organ implantation came at the end of our initial training period. The secondary heart, they called it. A backup cardiovascular system that would allow us to survive wounds that would kill normal men. The surgery took place in the monastery's deepest chambers, in operating theaters that dated back to the days of the Great Crusade. Ancient machinery hummed with barely contained power as the apothecaries prepared their instruments, their servo arms moving with mechanical precision as they opened my chest and began reshaping my physiology. I was conscious throughout the procedure. The apothecaries explained that pain was part of the process, that learning to function while experiencing agony was a crucial skill for any space marine. They were right. Over the following years, I would be shot, stabbed, burned, frozen, poisoned, and crushed more times than I could count. The ability to compartmentalize pain and continue fighting would save my life again and again. But it would also cost me something essential: something that I didn't even realize I was losing until it was already gone. The months that followed were a blur of additional surgeries and escalating trials. The os modula, which strengthened our bones until they could turn aside chainsword blades. The biscopeia, which enhanced our muscle density and reaction time beyond human limits. The hemastamen, which improved our blood's oxygen-carrying capacity and allowed us to survive in environments that would asphyxiate normal humans. Each implant brought us closer to the Astartes ideal, but further from the children we had once been. I stopped dreaming about my mother's bread during this period. I stopped dreaming about Matthias, about the copper sky of Viridia Prime, about anything that connected me to my previous existence. The chapter's conditioning programs were designed to sever these ties, to create warriors who would serve the Emperor without the distraction of personal loyalties or emotional attachments. They were remarkably effective. By the time I received my 13th organ implant, the catalepsian node that allowed me to remain alert even during periods of rest, I had forgotten what it felt like to miss home. I had forgotten that I had ever had a home at all. The black carapace was the final implantation, the interface that would allow me to merge with the machine spirits of power armor and weapons. It was also the most dangerous. Of the 11 aspirants who had survived to that point, 4 died during the procedure. Their bodies rejected the synthetic material, and they expired in agony as their immune systems attacked the foreign tissue. We watched them die in the recovery chambers, their forms convulsing as the carapace toxins spread through their bloodstreams. I felt nothing as they screamed. Nothing at all. This absence of feeling was the truest sign that my transformation was complete. I had become something that could watch children die without experiencing grief or compassion. Something that could witness suffering and remain focused on tactical objectives. I had become what the Imperium needed me to be. I had become a weapon. The ceremony that marked my full induction into the Blood Ravens took place in the chapter's Reclusium, a vast cathedral chamber carved from black stone and illuminated by thousands of devotional candles. Chaplain Mordecus spoke the words of binding, the oath that would tie my soul to the chapter's service for whatever remained of my existence. I knelt before the altar of the Emperor and swore to defend humanity against its enemies, to serve the throne without question, and to die before allowing dishonor to stain the chapter's reputation. When I rose from that altar, I was no longer the farm boy from Viridia Prime. I was Brother Cassius, battle brother of the Blood Ravens' 3rd Company, servant of the Emperor of Mankind. The name I had been given at birth was recorded in the chapter archives but never spoken again. That person had died during the transformation process, and what emerged was something new, something purposeful, something empty of everything that had once made him human. My first combat deployment came 3 months later, aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury. Our destination was a forge world called Metallica Zevon, where reports indicated a possible chaos incursion threatening the planet's industrial output. The journey took 6 weeks through the warp, 6 weeks during which I experienced my first true taste of what existence as a space marine would entail. Training. Constant, relentless, endless training. We practiced boarding actions in the ship's mock-up corridors, fighting room-to-room battles against servitors programmed with the tactical patterns of known enemy forces. We studied enemy psychological profiles until we could predict heretic behavior with mathematical precision. We maintained our equipment with devotional care, learning that every bolt, every power cell, every piece of equipment was a sacred tool in the Emperor's service. We prayed, we meditated, we prepared our minds for the certainty of violence that awaited us on every world we would ever visit. But mostly, we learned to function as a unit. Individual identity, the sergeants told us, was a luxury that the Adeptus Astartes could not afford. We were not 11 separate warriors fighting for personal glory. We were a single weapon with 11 components, each one expendable if its sacrifice would serve the greater tactical objective. This lesson was reinforced through combat simulations where squad members were randomly designated as casualties, requiring the survivors to adapt their tactics on the fly while showing no emotional response to their brothers' deaths. I learned to watch my squad mates die and immediately reassess my firing angles to maximize the effectiveness of our remaining firepower. I learned to step over their bodies without breaking stride if the mission required forward momentum. I learned to strip ammunition and equipment from their corpses if supplies ran low, treating their remains as battlefield resources rather than the shells of men I had trained beside for months. These were necessary skills. In the campaigns that followed, they would save my life and the lives of countless Imperial citizens. But they came at a cost that the recruitment posters never mention, a price paid in the gradual erosion of everything that had once made me capable of human connection. Metallica 7 was a world of perpetual industrial twilight, its skies choked with the exhaust of 10,000 manufactorums, while its surface remained hidden beneath layers of rockcrete and steel. The chaos incursion had begun in the planetary capital's lower industrial sectors, where reports suggested that factory workers had been engaging in forbidden rituals involving the machine spirits of their equipment. Word and blade units had been dispatched to investigate, but their Vox communications had ceased 3 days before our arrival. Our mission was simple: investigate the source of the disturbance, eliminate any heretical influences we discovered, and restore the planet's manufacturing capacity to acceptable levels. The lives of the individual workers were considered acceptable losses if their sacrifice preserved the Forge world's strategic value to the wider war effort. We made planetfall during the world's artificial night cycle, when the manufactorums reduced their output to conserve reactor fuel. Our drop pods struck the industrial sector's primary thoroughfare with precision impacts, each one calculated to minimize damage to surrounding infrastructure while providing optimal tactical positioning for urban combat operations. When the ramps lowered and we emerged into the sulfur-tainted air, I got my first taste of what real warfare would be like. The silence was wrong. Metallica 7 should have been thundering with the sounds of industrial production, but the streets lay empty and quiet except for the distant hum of automated systems. Warning runes flickered from voxcasters mounted on corridor walls, broadcasting messages in high Gothic that spoke of quarantine protocols and mandatory curfews. The air itself tasted of metal and corruption, carrying scents that my enhanced olfactory systems identified as human decomposition mixed with something else, something that didn't belong in any Imperial database. Brother Sergeant Thalion raised his fist to signal a halt as we approached the first manufactorum complex. Through the facility's reinforced windows, we could see movement in the shadows. Human shapes, but moving in patterns that suggested coordination rather than panic. They were waiting for us. They had been waiting for some time. The first shots came from elevated positions, autogun rounds that sparked harmlessly off our power armor while revealing the positions of our attackers. They were indeed factory workers, but their flesh had been altered by influences that corrupted both mind and body. Mechanical augmentations sprouted from their limbs in configurations that violated every principle of orthodox Imperial technology, while their faces showed signs of mutation that spoke of exposure to warp energies. We responded with disciplined bolter fire, our weapons singing their hymns of purification as mass reactive shells found their targets. The corrupted workers died quickly, their modified bodies offering no protection against weapons designed to kill armored enemies. But for every cultist that fell, 2 more emerged from the shadows. They had been organized. They had been expecting us. They had prepared. The battle lasted 4 hours and took us through 17 different industrial complexes before we reached the source of the corruption. In the deepest levels of the primary manufactorum, we found what remained of the word-bearer infiltration team that had initiated the uprising. They had established a shrine to the Dark Mechanicus in the facility's reactor chamber, using the Forge world's own power systems to amplify their blasphemous rituals. The shrine itself was a fusion of technology and flesh that hurt to look at directly, a writhing mass of human tissue and corrupted machinery that pulsed with malevolent energy. Standing before the shrine was something that had once been human, but now served as a vessel for the powers that dwelt in the warp. It spoke to us in voices that belonged to the dead workers, promising us knowledge that would surpass the limited understanding of the Omnissiah. It offered us power beyond the crude augmentations of our gene seed, evolution beyond the restrictions of our flesh. It showed us visions of what we could become if we abandoned our loyalty to the Corpse Emperor and embraced the truth of chaos. I felt nothing as I raised my bolter and put 6 mass-reactive rounds through its center mass. Nothing except satisfaction at the successful completion of our mission parameters. The corrupted being collapsed into constituent flesh and metal components, its death cry echoing through the reactor chamber as the shrine's power source flickered and died. The corruption that had spread through Metallica the Seven's industrial sector would wither without its focal point, and the planet's manufacturing capacity could be restored within standard parameters. We had won our first victory. We had served the Emperor. We had protected the Imperium from the influence of chaos. Everything had proceeded exactly as our training had prepared us to expect. But as we prepared to extract from the facility, Brother Varian made an observation that would haunt me for decades afterward. The corrupted workers, he noted, had fought with desperate courage, even though they faced impossible odds. They had died defending something they believed in, something that had given their lives meaning beyond mere survival. Their corruption had been absolute, their damnation certain, but they had died with purpose. We, by contrast, had killed them efficiently and without emotion. We had served our function perfectly, but we had felt nothing while doing so. No anger at their heresy, no satisfaction at their defeat, no grief for the lives they had wasted in service to dark powers. We had simply eliminated them because our orders required it, the same way we might repair a damaged piece of equipment or clean the barrel of a bolter. This realization should have troubled me, but it didn't. I had been conditioned to see this emotional emptiness as strength rather than loss. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, I would find myself wondering what it might feel like to care about something enough to die for it, to believe in something so deeply that death seemed preferable to abandonment of that belief. I would never know. The conditioning that had made me an effective warrior had also made me incapable of that kind of faith. I served the Emperor because I had been programmed to serve, not because I had chosen to believe. I fought chaos because my orders required it, not because I understood why their influence was worth opposing. I protected humanity not from love, but from duty, and duty without love is simply obedience to authority. This is what they don't tell you about becoming a space marine. Yes, you gain strength beyond human limits. Yes, you acquire weapons and armor that make you nearly invincible against conventional threats. Yes, you become part of something larger and more significant than any individual could hope to achieve alone. But you lose the ability to choose your own path. You lose the capacity for doubt, for questioning, for the kind of independent thought that might lead you to make decisions based on personal conviction rather than institutional obligation. You lose the ability to form meaningful relationships with other human beings because you are no longer human yourself. You become a tool in service of an ideal that you can no longer truly comprehend because you lack the emotional capacity to understand what makes that ideal worth preserving. The campaigns that followed Metallica 7 blended together into a continuous cycle of violence and victory. Orc incursions on agri-worlds where we slaughtered greenskins by the thousands while the local populations cheered our arrival. Tau expeditions on industrial planets where we fought running battles against pulse rifle formations and battlesuits that could match our power armor pound for pound. Tyrannid swarms on death worlds where we held defensive positions until ammunition ran low and then continued fighting with combat knives and bare hands until reinforcements arrived or we died in the attempt. Each campaign taught me new lessons about warfare, about tactics, about the countless ways that enemies of the Imperium could be killed or neutralized. I learned to read battlefield conditions at a glance, to adapt our squad's firing patterns to maximize casualties, while minimizing ammunition expenditure. I learned to identify weak points in enemy formations and exploit them with surgical precision. I learned to fight in every environment, from the vacuum of space to the crushing depths of ocean trenches, against every type of threat, from mindless beasts to strategic masterminds who could anticipate our movements and counter them with equal skill. But I never learned to care about the people we were ostensibly protecting. The billions of Imperial citizens who lived and died according to the outcomes of our battles remained abstract concepts rather than individuals worthy of personal concern. They were strategic assets to be preserved when possible, and acceptable losses when necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. This emotional detachment served me well when we were deployed to deal with rebellion on civilized worlds. Worlds where Imperial citizens had been led astray by charismatic leaders who promised them better lives if they threw off the yoke of Imperial taxation and regulation. Worlds where families fought against our arrival because they genuinely believed that independence would serve their children's interests better than continued membership in the Imperium. On Castellan IV, we fought through residential districts where every building had been turned into a fortress by citizens who had decided that death was preferable to surrender. They used furniture as barricades, kitchen knives as weapons, and their own children as human shields, because they knew that we would not hesitate to fire through civilian casualties to reach our tactical objectives. They were right. We didn't hesitate. We couldn't hesitate. The conditioning that had stripped away our capacity for empathy had also eliminated our ability to recognize the moral complexity of situations where good people found themselves on the wrong side of Imperial policy. I killed a woman on Castellan IV who was trying to evacuate her infant son from a building that we needed to secure for strategic reasons. She was unarmed, posed no threat to our mission, and was clearly attempting to preserve innocent life rather than resist our operations. But she was in our way, and eliminating obstacles was part of our function. I put a single bolt round through her center mass and continued advancing without breaking stride. The infant died in the subsequent explosion when Brother Gavius used frag grenades to clear the rest of the building. I felt nothing, no regret, no guilt, no sense that I had committed an act that might be worthy of moral consideration. The woman had been a tactical problem that required a tactical solution. Her death had served the Emperor's interests by allowing us to complete our mission more efficiently. The infant had been an acceptable casualty in service of the greater strategic objective. These were facts, not tragedies. But that night, during the meditation period that followed every combat operation, I found myself trying to remember what the woman had looked like, not for any emotional reason, but because I realized that I could not form a clear image of her face, even though I had killed her less than 6 hours earlier. She had been human, female, approximately 30 standard years in age, but beyond those basic tactical details, she had not registered as worthy of memory. She had been an obstacle, nothing more. This troubled me not because I felt guilt about her death, but because it suggested that my conditioning might be interfering with my ability to process tactical intelligence. If I could not remember the faces of enemies I had killed, how could I be certain that I was not overlooking important details that might prove relevant to future operations? If civilians had become so abstract in my perception that I could not distinguish one from another, how could I accurately assess population compliance levels or identify potential resistance leaders? I brought these concerns to Chaplain Mordicus during my next confession session. He listened to my report with the mechanical attention that all chaplains brought to matters of spiritual maintenance, then informed me that my observations were evidence of successful conditioning rather than cause for concern. The ability to eliminate obstacles without emotional interference was precisely what the chapter required from its battle brothers. The fact that I could no longer perceive individual civilians as significant suggested that I had successfully transcended the limitations of human empathy that might otherwise compromise my effectiveness. He was right, of course. Over the following decades, my inability to form meaningful memories of the people I killed would prove strategically valuable in countless situations. I could fight through civilian areas without the hesitation that might give enemies opportunities to exploit my positioning. I could make triage decisions about casualty evacuation without being distracted by personal attachment to wounded comrades. I could sacrifice squad mates when necessary without experiencing the grief that might cloud my tactical judgment. But it also meant that I would never again experience the satisfaction of protecting something I cared about. Victory became a technical achievement rather than an emotional reward. Survival was simply the continuation of function rather than something to be celebrated. Success meant nothing more than the completion of assigned objectives according to acceptable parameters. This is the price of becoming an angel. You gain the power to protect humanity, but you lose the ability to understand why humanity is worth protecting. You become capable of incredible acts of heroism, but you can no longer comprehend what makes heroism meaningful. You serve the greatest cause in human history, but you cannot remember why that cause matters to the people whose lives depend on your service. The centuries passed. Campaigns blended into campaigns until I could no longer distinguish one battlefield from another without consulting my personal mission logs. I was promoted to veteran status after my first century of service, then to sergeant after my second. The Blood Ravens recognized my tactical competence and granted me command responsibilities that allowed me to shape the combat effectiveness of entire squads. I trained new battle brothers in the methods that had served me well, passing on the lessons I had learned about the necessity of emotional detachment and absolute obedience to orders. I was, by all objective measures, a success. My kill count exceeded chapter averages by significant margins. My squads consistently achieved mission objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. My tactical innovations were incorporated into standard operating procedures and distributed to other companies. I had become exactly what the recruitment posters promised, a living weapon in service of humanity's protection. But success brought its own revelations. As I gained experience and seniority within the chapter, I began to observe patterns in our deployment assignments that suggested certain uncomfortable truths about the nature of our service. We were not primarily deployed to defend humanity against external threats, as the propaganda suggested. We were deployed to enforce compliance with imperial authority, regardless of whether that authority served the interests of the populations we protected. On Vos Prime, we suppressed a worker uprising that had been triggered by the planetary governor's decision to increase factory output quotas while reducing nutritional allowances. The workers had not been corrupted by chaos or influenced by Xeno's manipulation. They had simply reached the conclusion that their current living conditions were unsustainable and that organized resistance might improve their circumstances. They were wrong, of course. Our intervention ensured that their living conditions became significantly worse, but their compliance with imperial taxation requirements improved dramatically. On Mordian, we participated in the pacification of a religious movement that had developed interpretations of the imperial creed that differed from orthodox ecclesiarchy doctrine. Their heresies were minor, involving questions about the precise nature of the emperor's divinity that had been debated by theological scholars for millennia. But their growing influence threatened the authority of local church officials, and authority could not be allowed to appear uncertain. We killed approximately 40,000 civilians during the 3-week campaign that followed, including the entire population of 6 settlements that had embraced the heretical teachings. On Necromunda, we supported Arbite's operations against gangs that had been interfering with the collection of imperial tithes from Hive City industrial sectors. The gangs were brutal organizations that preyed on civilian populations for their own profit, but they were also the only effective check on the power of corporate overlords whose exploitation of workers exceeded even imperial standards for acceptable resource extraction. Our elimination of gang resistance resulted in measurably improved tithe collection, but it also led to working conditions that killed more civilians in the following year than gang violence had killed in the previous decade. Each of these campaigns was a tactical success. Each one achieved its stated objectives with minimal expenditure of chapter resources. Each one strengthened imperial control over populations that might otherwise have developed independence movements or resistance organizations. Each one served the emperor's interests by ensuring continued compliance with centralized authority. But they also serve to illustrate the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Space Marine existence. We were created to protect humanity, but we spent most of our time killing humans who had reached conclusions about their own interests that differed from those of Imperial administrators. We were sold as humanity's guardians, but we functioned as humanity's wardens. We preserved the Imperium not by defending it against external threats, but by ensuring that internal dissent could never develop into effective resistance. This realization should have troubled me, but it didn't. The conditioning that had made me an effective warrior had also made me incapable of questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying my service. I could observe patterns and draw tactical conclusions, but I could not evaluate those conclusions according to moral criteria that might suggest alternatives to my current function. I served because I had been programmed to serve, not because I had chosen to believe that service was inherently valuable. But observation, even without emotional response, still provided information, and over time, that information began to accumulate into an understanding of what I had truly become. I was not a guardian angel protecting innocent civilians from monstrous threats. I was an enforcement mechanism, ensuring compliance with political structures that prioritized stability over justice, efficiency over compassion, and authority over individual welfare. I was not a hero serving a cause greater than myself. I was a tool wielded by administrators who had never experienced combat, but understood that violence could solve problems that negotiation and compromise could not address effectively. I was not protecting humanity. I was controlling it. The 4th century of my service brought assignment to the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos tasked with eliminating alien threats to Imperial space. This should have been a return to the simple clarity of the Metallica 7 campaign: clear enemies, obvious objectives, straightforward tactical solutions. Aliens were not human. They could not claim Imperial citizenship or appeal to human sympathy. They could be killed without moral ambiguity because their very existence threatened human survival. But even the Death Watch could not provide the clarity I had hoped for. My first assignment was the elimination of a Tau diplomatic mission that had been attempting to establish trade relationships with Imperial worlds along the Damocles Gulf. The Tau were offering advanced medical technology in exchange for raw materials that their expanding empire required for continued industrial growth. Several planetary governors had expressed interest in the proposed arrangements, seeing opportunities to improve living conditions for their populations while maintaining acceptable tithe levels for the administratum. The Ordo Xenos had determined that these negotiations represented an unacceptable security risk, not because the Tau were planning military action against Imperial worlds, but because their diplomatic success might encourage other Xenos species to attempt similar approaches. The Imperium's official policy toward alien life was extinction rather than coexistence, and any deviation from that policy would be interpreted as weakness by enemies throughout the galaxy. We eliminated the Tau delegation during a formal dinner hosted by the governor of Pavonis. 43 aliens died in the initial assault, along with 17 human negotiators and 26 civilian staff members who had been present when we breached the dining facility. The governor himself survived because his security detail had been briefed on our operational timeline, but he was later executed for treason by an Ordo Hereticus tribunal that found his participation in the negotiations to be evidence of corruption by alien influence. The tactical execution was flawless. No Tau survived to report the incident to their superiors, and the elimination of human witnesses ensured that word of our intervention would not spread to other worlds where similar negotiations might be taking place. The diplomatic mission disappeared without trace, allowing the Imperium to maintain plausible deniability while discouraging future alien attempts at peaceful contact. But the intelligence reports we recovered from the Tau delegation revealed information that complicated the simple narrative of alien threat that justified our actions. The Tau had indeed been attempting to establish trade relationships with imperial worlds, but their motivations were not the expansionist conquest that Ordo Xenos briefings had suggested. Their empire was struggling to support refugee populations displaced by Tyranid swarm incursions, and they needed additional resources to maintain civilian survival rates at acceptable levels. Their offers of medical technology were genuine attempts to provide valuable goods in exchange for raw materials that the imperial worlds could spare without compromising their own strategic capabilities. The Tau had been attempting to save lives, not human lives perhaps, but lives nonetheless. They had been offering solutions to problems that killed thousands of imperial citizens every year. They had been trying to create relationships that might reduce conflict rather than escalate it. And we had killed them for it. This should not have mattered to me. Tau civilians were still aliens, regardless of their circumstances. Their survival was not my responsibility, and their destruction served imperial interests by eliminating a potential long-term threat to human expansion. The fact that they had been motivated by desperation rather than aggression was tactically irrelevant to the strategic necessity of maintaining imperial isolation from alien influence. But for the first time in 3 centuries, I found myself questioning whether the completion of mission objectives necessarily constituted a successful outcome, not from any emotional attachment to the dead Tau, but from a tactical perspective that considered longer-term consequences rather than immediate results. The elimination of the diplomatic mission had indeed prevented the establishment of trade relationships that might have encouraged other aliens to attempt similar approaches. But it had also eliminated opportunities for intelligence gathering that might have provided valuable information about Tau capabilities, intentions, and weaknesses. It had strengthened imperial isolation, but it had also eliminated potential allies against Tyranid incursions that threatened both human and Tau populations. It had preserved ideological purity, but it had sacrificed strategic flexibility that might prove crucial in future conflicts. These observations troubled me not because I felt regret about the deaths we had caused, but because they suggested that the decision-making processes that governed our deployment might be prioritizing abstract principles over concrete results. If the Imperium's survival was truly our primary objective, then shouldn't we be willing to compromise on ideological positions when such compromises offered strategic advantages? If protecting humanity was our ultimate goal, then shouldn't we be willing to work with aliens when such cooperation served human interests? But the conditioning that had made me an effective warrior had also made me incapable of pursuing such questions to their logical conclusions. I could observe inconsistencies in imperial policy, but I could not evaluate whether those inconsistencies were problems that required solutions or necessary sacrifices in service of objectives that I was not qualified to understand. I could identify tactical alternatives that might achieve better outcomes, but I could not determine whether better tactical outcomes were necessarily preferable to outcomes that better served political or theological considerations that superseded purely military concerns. I served because I had been programmed to serve. The fact that I no longer understood why my service was valuable did not change my obligation to continue serving. The fact that I could no longer remember what I was fighting to protect did not eliminate my duty to continue fighting. The fact that I had become something that could question its own purpose while remaining incapable of changing its behavior was simply another aspect of what I had become. The final revelation came during my 5th century of service, on a world whose name I was ordered to forget immediately upon completion of our mission. A world that officially did not exist in imperial records, though it had once been home to 17 billion human souls. We were deployed there not to fight aliens or heretics, but to eliminate evidence of a failed experiment in imperial genetic engineering. The world's population had been selected for a project that would have created humans capable of surviving in environments too hostile for normal colonization. Enhanced lung capacity for thin atmospheres, modified skin pigmentation for high radiation environments, improved bone density for heavy gravity worlds. The Adeptus Mechanicus had promised the Administratum that such modifications would allow imperial expansion into previously uninhabitable systems, opening new frontiers for human colonization without the massive infrastructure investments that terraforming required. The project had succeeded beyond all expectations. The modified humans were indeed capable of thriving in hostile environments, but they had also developed capabilities that their creators had not anticipated. Enhanced cognitive function, improved disease resistance, extended lifespans that exceeded normal human ranges by centuries rather than decades. They had become something new, something that might eventually supersede baseline humanity entirely. This could not be allowed. The Imperium was built on the fundamental assumption that human nature was static, that the species had achieved its perfect form during the dark age of technology, and that any deviation from that form represented corruption rather than evolution. The modified humans represented a challenge to every principle that justified imperial authority over human affairs. If humanity could be improved through scientific manipulation, then perhaps other aspects of imperial doctrine were equally open to revision. The solution was total population elimination, followed by orbital bombardment that would reduce the world's surface to molten glass. No evidence of the experiment would survive. No modified humans would escape to spread their genetic alterations to other worlds, and no records would exist to suggest that the project had ever been attempted. The world would become another cautionary tale about the dangers of unsanctioned scientific research, a reminder of why the Adeptus Mechanicus required careful oversight from orthodox imperial authorities. We were chosen for the mission not because of our combat capabilities, but because of our psychological conditioning. Normal Imperial Guard regiments might experience moral qualms about exterminating human populations that posed no military threat. Planetary defense forces might question orders that required them to kill their own species for the crime of successful evolution. But Space Marines could be relied upon to follow orders regardless of their personal feelings about those orders, because we no longer had personal feelings that might interfere with our operational effectiveness. The campaign lasted 6 months, not because the modified humans offered significant military resistance, but because 17 billion individuals required time to locate and eliminate even with orbital support. They had built cities that extended deep underground, anticipating that their world's hostile surface conditions might require extensive subterranean development. They had developed technologies that allowed them to remain hidden from our scanning equipment for extended periods. Most significantly, they had created social structures that prioritized collective survival over individual preservation, meaning that parents would sacrifice themselves to protect their children, and communities would coordinate their defensive efforts rather than fragment into competing factions. They fought us with a desperation that I had rarely encountered in previous campaigns. Not the mindless fury of chaos cultists or the mechanical determination of Tau warriors, but the calculated ferocity of people who understood exactly what our victory would mean for them and their children. They knew that we had not come to conquer their world or demand their compliance with imperial authority. They knew that we had come to eliminate them entirely, to erase their existence so completely that no trace of their achievements would survive to inspire others. They fought like humans, defending their families, their homes, their future. They fought with the kind of passionate commitment that I had observed in the corrupted workers on Metallica the Seven, but directed toward preservation rather than destruction. They fought for something they loved more than life itself, something that made death preferable to surrender. And we killed them all. Every man, woman, and child, every family line, every cultural tradition, every technological innovation that might have improved the human condition. We eliminated a civilization that had achieved in 3 generations what the Imperium had been struggling to accomplish for 10,000 years, not because they threatened humanity, but because they represented what humanity might become. I was present for the final phase of the operation, the elimination of the last underground shelter complex, where approximately 12,000 civilians had taken refuge. Men and women who had never taken up arms against the Imperium, children who had been born after our arrival, and would die before their first birthdays, elderly individuals whose only crime was surviving long enough to witness the apotheosis of their species. They were not hiding when we breached their final defenses. They were not begging for mercy or attempting to negotiate terms for their survival. They were singing. 12,000 voices raised in harmonies that resonated through the tunnel systems they had called home, melodies that spoke of love and loss and hope despite the certainty of extinction. They were singing because they wanted their last act as a species to be beautiful rather than desperate, creative rather than destructive, human rather than merely functional. I killed them while they sang. We all did. Our bolters sang their own hymns as mass-reactive shells found their targets, each shot precisely calculated to ensure maximum casualties while minimizing ammunition expenditure. The music stopped in sections as voices were silenced forever, until only echoes remained to mark the passage of the last genetically enhanced humans in the galaxy. When the killing was finished and the orbital bombardment began, I stood on the command deck of our strike cruiser and watched the world die. Cyclonic torpedoes cracked its crust, while virus bombs sterilized any organic material that might have survived our ground operations. Within 6 hours, the world that had once been home to 17 billion enhanced humans had become a ball of cooling magma orbiting a star that would eventually be removed from Imperial navigation charts. The mission was a complete success. No evidence survived to suggest that the genetic enhancement project had ever been attempted. No modified humans escaped to spread their alterations to other worlds. No records existed to indicate that humanity might be capable of evolution beyond its current limitations. The Imperium remained secure in its assumptions about the static nature of human biology and the necessity of preventing unauthorized scientific research. But as I watched that world burn, I found myself remembering something I had not thought about in centuries: the taste of my mother's bread. Sweet honey and grain from the southern fields of Viridia Prime, baked in the early hours before the work bells rang across our settlement. The memory came without warning, without context, without explanation. I had not thought about my mother or my childhood or anything connected to my previous existence since my first century of service. The conditioning that had made me an effective warrior had successfully eliminated such attachments as unnecessary impediments to my function. Yet somehow, watching the destruction of 17 billion people who had died singing, I remembered what it felt like to be human. I remembered what it felt like to taste something made with love rather than mere nutritional necessity. I remembered what it felt like to anticipate pleasure rather than simply endure existence. I remembered what it felt like to be part of something that existed for reasons beyond tactical efficiency and strategic advantage. And I realized what I had lost. Not just my humanity, which I had been taught to regard as a necessary sacrifice in service of a greater cause. Not just my capacity for emotional response, which I had been conditioned to see as weakness that would compromise my effectiveness as a warrior. I had lost the ability to understand what made life worth living, what made survival worth struggling for, what made existence preferable to extinction. The enhanced humans had died singing because they still remembered what it meant to be human despite their genetic modifications. They had preserved something that I had been systematically stripped of during my transformation into an instrument of imperial will. They had remained capable of love, of hope, of beauty, of all the things that gave meaning to existence beyond mere biological function. I had become something that could eliminate beauty without comprehending what beauty was. I had become something that could destroy love without understanding what love meant. I had become something that could extinguish hope while remaining ignorant of what hope offered to those who possessed it. I had become the perfect servant of an empire that preserved humanity by destroying everything that made humanity worth preserving. But this realization changed nothing. I could observe the loss without regretting it, understand the sacrifice without questioning its necessity, recognize the price without considering it excessive. The conditioning that had created these capabilities had also ensured that I would continue serving regardless of my personal assessment of that service's value. I was incapable of rebellion, incapable of doubt, incapable of choosing a different path, even if I could imagine what such a path might entail. I was exactly what the Imperium needed me to be. Nothing more, nothing less. The centuries since that nameless world have blended together into an endless cycle of deployment and victory, conflict and resolution, service without purpose or satisfaction, or hope of anything beyond continued service. I have killed millions of enemies of the Imperium, protected billions of Imperial citizens, and preserved the stability of countless worlds against threats both internal and external. I have served the Emperor faithfully for over 400 years, and I will continue serving until battle damage or age finally claims my enhanced physiology. I am a hero of the Imperium, a living legend, a guardian angel protecting humanity from the darkness beyond the stars. Children throughout Imperial space dream of becoming what I have become, imagine themselves wielding the weapons I carry, and wearing the armor that has turned aside countless attacks. They see me as the embodiment of everything noble and pure about human civilization, a figure worthy of worship and emulation. They do not know that I can no longer remember why their dreams matter. They do not know that I have forgotten what it feels like to care about anything beyond the completion of assigned objectives. They do not know that I have become something that can protect them without understanding what makes them worth protecting, something that can serve their interests without comprehending what those interests entail. They do not know that in becoming their guardian, I have ceased to be one of them. And perhaps that is the greatest victory chaos could achieve against the Imperium. Not the corruption of its servants, but the creation of servants so pure in their dedication that they can no longer comprehend the value of what they serve. Not the destruction of humanity, but the transformation of humanity's protectors into something that preserves human life without preserving human meaning. We are the Adeptus Astartes. We are the Emperor's finest warriors. We are the shield that stands between mankind and the darkness that would devour it. We are no longer human, and we have forgotten why humanity matters. But we will continue serving. We will continue fighting. We will continue killing in the Emperor's name until nothing remains of us but the echoes of bolter, fire, and the memory of wars whose purpose we can no longer recall. We are angels without heaven, guardians without understanding, protectors without love. We are exactly what we were designed to be.